The federal government, Janet Yellen, Jerome Powell, the Federal Reserve, and everyone else in the upper echelon of the United States government that has anything to do with the information that is to be distributed to the public about monetary policy, well, these people are lying to you about inflation and how hard it's going to be hitting the American public, consistently saying for the past couple of years that inflation was going to be nothing more than transitory, and with it, we see the people who are now going to the grocery store, buying their amenities that they need, filling up their cars with gas, paying for their Ubers, going out and doing the things that they want to go do. They see that they're now spending more in the process to actually do so. And with it, so many people have become poor and destitute solely based off the fact of inflation galvanizing their wages. And with it, we see that the dollar has diminished drastically over the course of the past 100 years. Let's go ahead and jump into the nature of how they've been consistently lying about inflation. I figure this would be a great place to start it off. This young man is sitting there in Costco with his family trying to get food. And if you're buying food in bulk, many of the times you do so because it would be cheaper. And if you're buying things in bulk, and when you're buying shit in bulk, it's much more expensive, I can promise you everything on an individual itemized level will be exorbitantly overpriced in comparison to the prices that were being pushed before, all due to the nature of inflation. Let's go ahead and jump into this footage. Here we see prices compared to 1 year ago are up at a minimum of 50% on all products at my local grocery stores and Costco. Let's go ahead and play.
So I'm walking around Costco here and I'm noticing these prices. For example, these Madras lentils, $15.99. I bought those a year ago for $6.99. I keep getting told that we got, 6-7% inflation. You gotta be kidding me. Let's look at what else we got going on here. We literally bought this chicken broth, $5.69, 2 months ago. Dang, this is the flour we were buying for $5.99 last year.
Flour for $5.99 that is now $12.49. And what we see is the nature of the increase of all of these goods, and the reason that people are having to pay more is due to inflation, and simply just that. It's not that people are getting price gouged. It's not the fact that, well, the corporations are just so greedy and they just want to make more money. Of course they want to make more money. But the thing is, they have to increase their prices because the value of the dollar has gone down. Therefore, there are more dollars chasing these goods, but the dollars themselves are worth less. Therefore, when they report profits, they are reporting record profits, but the record profits still do not have record value because of the fact that the dollar is losing value. Alrighty. Now we're going to go ahead and jump into this, and this is from Wall Street Silver. It says September inflation numbers are up again, hitting 5% annualized, driven by rising food costs, but especially rising energy costs after Joe Biden's administrative fight versus domestic energy, after which he drained the Strategic Petroleum Reserve and sold it all to China. It's looking like COVID was the crisis they always wanted, and now they're keeping the trillion-dollar spending that's keeping us in a permanent inflationary state. They don't have an exit plan. In fact, every plan they have just makes it worse. And this is where you want to ask the question, is it that these people are simply economically illiterate, or are they Machiavellian tricksters that are looking forward to the downfall of civil society, and they are simply hoping that they can afford to avoid all the problems that they are making plague you? Let's go ahead and jump into now. We have Peter St. Onge saying fresh inflation numbers came in high again, marking the third month of worsening numbers. Let's go ahead and jump into this footage. Peter St. Onge, a fantastic economist from the Heritage Foundation, as well as a former Mises professor. I cannot recommend him enough. Let's go ahead and jump into this footage.
Fresh inflation numbers are out, and as we have been saying for months now, there is no sign inflation is going away. What came out was September CPI, which in theory tallies up the price of everything Americans buy. It came in higher than Wall Street expected, clocking 0.4% on the month, which is almost 5% annualized. That makes 3 months now of flat or rising inflation. Meanwhile, core CPI, that strips out food and energy, which is the number the Fed cares about, was once again stuck above 4%. This is bad because every month core stays above 4, and that's over 2 years now. It bakes in inflation, meaning that people adjust their lives around future inflation. They negotiate higher contracts, they raise prices, they invest on the assumption that prices will rise significantly. The Fed fears this because it's afraid it'll become a self-fulfilling prophecy, that people expect inflation, and so inflation happens. That scares the Fed more than an unadjusted economic statistic. So with these latest numbers, at this point, consumer prices are up 17% since Joe Biden took office. That's 17% official numbers. You can use your imagination for the true figures. Even at 17, though, this means the typical American family is now $7,300 poorer per year than they were when Joe fixed America. So that's about $600 per month hit to the typical American family. Now, a lot of that came out of groceries and the gas pump. Food is up 20%. Again, these are the official numbers, with meat jumping closer to 25%. That's partly because farmers culled their herds because feed and labor costs went up so much that they could not afford to feed them. So yes, inflation kills cows. Even pet food is up almost 25%, putting Fido on borrowed time. In energy costs, it has been brutal. And gasoline is up almost 60%, home heating oil nearly 80%. This is largely because Joe Biden strangled America's energy renaissance and then drained our strategic petroleum reserve and sold a bunch of it to China. So it's about half gone at this point. And yes, you will wear 2 sweaters and you will be happy. And finally, the big one, housing. Between soaring home costs, leaping mortgage rates, and flying insurance and property taxes, housing costs have more than doubled under Joe Biden. So that racks up at least $1,000 in extra costs per month for the median home. All this is up against earnings that have fallen hard under Biden for 2 reasons. First, because wages fell behind inflation, as always happens. And second, because companies are now cutting hours in preparation for the recession that everybody knows is coming unless they are paid not to know. So what's next? Brought to you by Unchained. What's next is a gradual realization by markets and voters that the stagflation of the past couple of years could be permanent, that it was not a one-off from lockdowns, rather it's the new normal as the federal government settled into its new crisis level of spending. Essentially, COVID was the crisis they always wanted, and now they're keeping the trillion-dollar deficits. With fresh wars and fresh recessions on the horizon, there is a lot more to come. Okay, we'll be watching. See you next time.
Spot on from Peter St. Onge, as per usual, and I genuinely cannot recommend him enough. Please go give him a follow. He's absolutely fantastic. We're going to be going into this thread from Game of Trades. Inflation is following the exact footsteps of the 1970s. Economists are wrong about what's coming next. And well, as we just saw from listening to Peter, if you were listening to economists from the Austrian School of Economics, you would actually have a sound grounding understanding of what is causing things like this massive spikes in inflation. But if you come from this Keynesian school of thought and you are someone who is pushing the fundamentals of modern monetary theory and endless printing, which is driving the value of the fiat currency completely into the gutter and completely diminishing the withholding power that the people within the American populace have, well, then you're going to be the people that are leading us astray down the path we're on now. And here we can see the consumer price index year-over-year percent change. This is showing the graph, and what we see is it appears that we are mirroring what has happened in the past when it comes to the nature of the inflationary cycle, except now we are possibly approaching a recession, which means we will be approaching that of an inflationary recession, which means we could get even harder than that of the people in the 70s that were hit by this massive inflationary spike when we were taken off of the gold standard and when oil was withheld, causing these massive spikes in inflation. So, on to the second part of this. It says oil prices increased from $3 to $30 per barrel between 1970 and 1982. During that time, U.S. home prices tripled, going from $22,000 to $66,000. Home prices have already surged from $320,000 to $420,000 since 2020, and USD has lost nearly 20% of its purchasing power in the last 3 years. All this due to the largest spike in inflation since the 1970s. Many economists suggest that inflation is following a similar path to the 1970s. Back then, there were 3 waves of inflation. If this is extrapolated to today, some argue we're still due for another wave of inflation. Commodities show signs of inflation returning. Oil prices have risen 40% since 2023. Sugar has gone up nearly 3 times since 2020, and live cattle has gone up nearly 2 times since 2020. Moving on, we see that energy has been the main driver of inflation since 2020, not because it's the largest component of the CPI, but due to its volatility alone. The volatility of inflation components is shown in the chart below. Motor fuel is the red line, price of gas, the pump, is the most volatility when it comes to any component in the market. And here we see the reason that is because oil is used for basically everything, whether it's for travel so we can have fuel for our vehicles, or whether it's the byproducts from oil so we can actually create things like plastics. Alrighty. The correlation between oil prices and inflation is strong because of oil's volatility and its impact on inflation. For a second wave of inflation, oil prices need to keep rising rapidly. An oil shock similar to the 1970s could cause oil prices to spike. In 1973, Arab oil-producing countries stopped shipping oil to the U.S., resulting in a massive wave of inflation. Just last month, Saudi Arabia and Russia announced oil cuts until the end of 2023. Fortunately, the U.S. is now the largest oil producer, so it can increase production to compensate for any future oil shortage like in 2022. So here's the thing, we would have actually had a large portion of oil to assist us in this if Biden had depleted our strategic reserves and sold it off to China. Unbelievable, but anyways, we see from 1970 to 2021, the supply was a huge driver of oil's prices. From 1996 to 2021, demand became more important. Demand now determines oil's production. And this is something that's so fascinating. And I would argue that the people in power who are pushing for electric vehicles and completely detaching ourselves from fossil fuels are realistically okay if oil comes exorbitantly priced, because that means it's pricing you out of the market from being able to use it, and they can just further push their rhetoric about green energy. The possibility of a recession is a problem for oil demand. Odds of a recession predicted by the yield curve are currently at the highest level in 40 years. Every time the probability has gone above 40%, the economy has seen a recession, except in 1967. Meanwhile, fiscal spending has seen a significant decrease, contrasting the big stimulus packages that saved the economy during the pandemic. And here's the thing, these massive stimulus packages were one of the major detrimental factors that caused inflation to skyrocket to the degree that it did. But you had so many people, it didn't matter the fact that they were told, look, you're going to be really biting this overhead cost in the future if you get this $1,800 now. They didn't care about that at all. They just wanted their money in hand. And realistically, due to the fact that they were suffering, they were pulled out of work, they needed to put food on their table for their families so they could feed their kids, can you even argue the fact of why they were saying, no, I need this money now? Even if they knew the detrimental impact it would have on them in the future, if you have to feed your kids, you're really put into a corner that's hard to back out of. Moving on, the $2 trillion in excess savings from 2021 have been depleted, indicating that the helicopter money is gone and the economy is back to pre-pandemic levels. Over the past 40 years, most Americans have experienced a decline in their share of national income, leaving the economy more vulnerable than 50 years ago when inequality was low. And here's the thing. They're talking about the fact of we are suffering with a major bout of inflation that we haven't seen in 40 years. With it, we see Americans are experiencing a major decline in national income. And with it, we also see that the cost of living is rising exponentially, which is only going to further drive people into the dirt and make them completely incapable of making themselves and their families sustainable, which will only drive more people into poverty and homelessness. In 2007, oil spiked from $60 to $120, heading into the worst downturn since the Great Depression. Oil prices bottomed when the Fed began cutting rates. A similar situation could occur, which would crush the struggling U.S. consumer. And what we see is, this is what precipitates a recession. To avoid a recession, fiscal stimulus rates cuts by the Fed have to be injected into the economy. This could lead to growth, but also with higher inflation as demand for oil rises. The Fed has made it clear that they do not want to risk a repeat of the 70s. But I'm going to be completely honest, I don't think they care. I think they will gladly repeat the 70s if it means that they can hold on to their seat of power. Let's go ahead and jump into these articles talking about the nature of what's going on with the dollar. Let's go. Know that when they tell you inflation is at 3.7%, they're talking about the inflation rate, and they are trying to trick you into thinking that inflation is only at roughly 3%. And that in itself is a lie. It's a lie by omission. But here's the thing. A lie by omission is one of the most devious lies. And why is it that in court you have to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Because if you don't tell the whole truth and you leave things out, then you could be obscuring the case, and with it you are lying by omission, and a lie by omission is still a lie. So that's exactly what they're doing about inflation. And here we see from Trueflation, 23.9%. U.S. inflation rate aggregated, average American purchasing power has been eroded by 23.9% since January 2020. And this isn't 1970s, since when we started tracking the CPI. This isn't back to the 1970s when we got off the gold standard. No, this isn't to 1913 when the creation of the Federal Reserve was instituted and we've had 23.9% inflation since then. This is 23.9% since January of 2020 when the COVID stimulus is kicked off. And what do we see that has caused this? We had two 20-year disaster wars with Iraq and Afghanistan. We had the COVID stimulus packages. We now have the limitless funding for Ukraine. We have the funding that will now be going to Israel, which will be fighting Hamas. We have the funding that will be going all the way over to go help Taiwan fight China in the future. We now have a conflict kicking off with Azerbaijan and Armenia. And what else? We now have to build the border wall because the Joe Biden administration is now admitting that the nature of the migrant crisis is a huge detriment to their voting bloc. Not to the fact that this isn't something that they wanted, which was to completely destabilize the voting bloc within America so they could shift more people and to get more Democratic voters. Which, that's an understandable plight if this is a way that you see of getting more voters to help you win elections. I think it's a really fucking scummy way of doing it, but I understand why you would do it. But here's the thing we have to understand. With doing so, they're bringing more people in they will have to put on government assistance, which will only drive up things like inflation ever higher. So, let's go ahead and jump into NerdWallet. The current inflation rate is 3.7%. Here's why it matters. Inflation increased 3.7% in September of 2023 from a year ago. Understanding what inflation is and why it matters and how to handle it can help when making financial decisions. And that's absolutely true. It's a shame that NerdWallet doesn't really explain the process of what really started inflation at its core. Anyways, here we see the current U.S. inflation rate is 3.7% for 12-month period leading up to September 2023. Inflation rose 0.4% in September from the previous month, according to the latest release from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Isn't that just fascinating? What is inflation? Inflation is the rate at which price of goods and services increases. As a result of inflation, the purchasing power and value of money decreases over time. Inflation affects the price of everything around us. Generally speaking, inflation can be caused by a number of factors. The recent surge in inflation has been driven at least by a part of supply chain issues, pent-up consumer demand, and economic stimulus from the pandemic. And they don't even talk about the main factor of all the way going back to the Federal Reserve's creation in 1913. Anyways, here we see they go through the different types of inflation. You can go ahead and pause this here, read that if you are not aware of them. We're going to go ahead and jump in a little further down this article into NerdWallet again. It says how inflation erodes your money. Enter an initial year, the price of a hypothetical purchase in that year, and a final year to see how much inflation has changed the value of money during that period, and how much purchasing power your money has lost. So, a perfect example of this, you could put in, you bought something for $100. Let's say you did this with the initial start being, I don't know, some arbitrary year, which is the standard at which they have, which for some reason it doesn't go back any further than 1913. It's just some arbitrary metric that they don't explain why they have it there. Oh wait, the Federal Reserve was created on December 23rd of 1913. So they don't even explain why they have this standard set, but they'll gladly use it. And this is another way of obscuring information, of completely keeping people economically illiterate, because they don't tell you the processes of what has led to inflation, which the initial inception of the creation of the Federal Reserve is something that has only made this worse, because it is nothing more than the lifeblood of the Leviathan that is the world empire, because it has limitless money printing because of the endless fiat from Jerome Powell and the Federal Reserve. So what we see is, let's say you bought something for $100 in 1913. That purchased item in 2023, the value of it is $3,073.01. So the one thing I want to check on, let's go ahead and do $1. $30.73. That is the degree of how much your dollar has lost. A dollar used to be able to get you so much more than it does today. And the thing that I really loved was talking to my grandfather before he passed, was about the nature of how cheap things used to be comparatively to today. And I remember being talked to when I was young about your Social Security card. And when he was young, they were handing out Social Security cards the first time. And him and his friends had a major deal about this. They were really pissed off because they were like, well, we're not just numbers. We're not just numbers for the government. So being told these stories in my youth, I guess it may have cultivated me into this mindset to a degree. But the thing that I found so unbelievable about it was these things that government just randomly decides to institute and make these arbitrary standards that they push on society. Many of the times the people of these societies do not agree with them, but they do not collectively come together to push back against the machinations of the state. And with it, we see that they suffer. So here we see, what does transitory inflation really mean? Well, no one really knows what transitory inflation means, and people like Janet Yellen, Jerome Powell, and so many people within the Biden administration love to talk about how, well, it's only transitory, it's going to go away in due time. So I figured we'd go ahead and go into it for a moment. Transitory inflation with a permanent price level effect. There are two types of transitory inflation. Inflation denotes an increase in the general price level. Since 2012, the Federal Reserve has targeted 2% inflation. The Fed, in other words, would typically like to see the price level increase by 2% each period. Of course, in any given period, inflation might be higher or lower than the Fed's target. A negative supply shock, for example, would tend to put upward pressure on prices. If the price level grows more quickly for a relative short period of time, one might describe the episode of being marked as transitory inflation. And now we go on to the second type. Transitory inflation without a permanent price level effect. Transitory inflation need not imply a permanent increase in the price level. Indeed, those using the word transitory in the second sense describe a scenario where the price level does not remain elevated. And here you can see it says, consider the scenario depicted in figure 2. Again, the price level is measured on the vertical axis, and that time is tracked on the horizontal axis. I would recommend reading this article if you are interested in anything that has to do with economics or understanding inflation. Also diving into that article from NerdWallet. But the thing I would truly recommend, of all things, if you were really going to go ahead and dive into anything that I'm recommending here, please go read this article from Murray Rothbard, Origins of the Federal Reserve. I will go ahead and jump into just the beginning. The Federal Reserve Act of December 23, 1913 was part of the parcel of the wave of progressive legislation on local, state, and federal levels of government that began about 1900. Progressivism was a baptism movement that in the course of the first 2 decades of the 20th century transformed the American economy and society from one of roughly laissez-faire to one of centralized statism. I'm going to leave it there. Please go read this article. Murray Rothbard, one of the greats. Thank you for watching if you got this far. Thumbs up if you liked it. Thumbs down if you didn't. Tell me where I'm wrong in the comment section down below. Stay lovely, stay great. Subscribe if you enjoy this kind of content. Peace out.